Now let's first start with how we can measure economic growth and how an economy is performing in terms of economic growth. So the one primary indicator we will usually use to measure the economic performance of a country is this indicator called real GDP. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, which measures the total aggregate value of final output produced within the geographical boundaries of a country over a given period of time, usually a year. Now, so that really means that we are calculating all the goods and services that's produced on the soil of the country, okay, in a year's time period. And we usually add the word real in front of GDP just to show that GDP has been adjusted for inflation. It makes sense to actually deduct the effects of inflation from this figure so that we know that people actually have an increase in purchasing power. Now, to look at the performance of a country, countries generally use this thing called real GDP growth, okay, instead of just looking at raw real GDP data. So we look at the change in real GDP when looking at quarter-on-quarter basis or year-on-year basis. When we say quarter-on-quarter basis, means we compare, like say for example, fourth quarter with third quarter. One quarter is 3 months, so January to March is one quarter, April to June is one quarter, July to September is one quarter, October to December is one quarter. So when we say quarter on quarter, we are comparing this quarter with the previous quarter. And if we are looking at year on year, we are comparing this year versus last year. So real GDP per capita is adding the word per capita behind real GDP. So that simply means that we are taking the real GDP dividing across the entire population of the country. So if we are looking at growth in real GDP per capita, we are looking at the change in real GDP per capita this year when we compare to the last year. And in many economics essays or case studies, you will see that in your diagrams, your ADAS diagram, sometimes we label the y-axis as RNY. RNY stands for real national income. It is generally acceptable to usually either use real national income or real GDP. Since we know from previous lessons that income and output and expenditure are the same and can be interchangeably used, real national income can also be used to gauge total expenditure and output in the economy other than just income. Let's now look at this concept of sustainable growth. Now, sustainable growth means that we want to achieve a rate of economic growth without any significant trade-offs relating to other micro or macroeconomic objectives. So, what are these trade-offs? It can be high inflation measured by changes in consumer price index. For example, when you have an increase in AD when the economy is operating at full employment level, but this is not matched by a company increase in aggregate supply, you will face higher inflation. Higher income inequity is measured by Gini coefficient, where wages are rising rapidly for the high income but stagnant or growing very slowly for the lower income. And lastly, increased environmental degradation, which we can use, say for example, PSI index. So an rapid increase in economic activity may result in more pollution because of increase in energy use, increase in waste generation, increase in emissions. So when we look at sustainable growth, we see how much your economic growth is increasing by. But we also look at these other indicators like consumer price index, like Gini coefficient, like PSI index, to see if there were significant trade-offs that came together as perhaps a consequence of economic growth. And inclusive growth is actually we only look at inclusive growth in the context of Singapore based on the A-level curriculum. But if we look at OECD's definition, inclusive growth refers to economic growth that is distributed fairly across society and creates opportunity for all. And if we want to see if economic growth is inclusive, we can look at whether an improvement in GDP has been accompanied by an improvement or worsening of the following indicators, which we shall see in the next slide. So for example, if we have economic growth, but if Gini coefficient is increasing, then we don't think that the growth is inclusive. So for growth to be considered to be inclusive, we want economic growth to be accompanied by a reduction in Gini coefficient, which will suggest that income inequity problem is actually improving in the country. Alternatively, we can also look at the growth in median wages. We want to see that an increase in economic growth also helps the average worker see an increase in wages by the same extent. But if income inequality is very high, then if we look at growth in median wages, we might not actually see that the average worker saw an increase in wages by the same extent.